Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. You know, lately I've been noticing on YouTube a lot of videos about homemade guns. Everything from the very crude contraptions of channels like Royal Nonesuch to progressively more sophisticated designs of channels like The Unknown Cat or Clinton Westwood. And even some fairly refined firearms produced by channels like Echo Machine. Now, I haven't built any firearms from scratch since starting this YouTube channel. I'll have to remedy that one of these days, but in the meantime, I thought it might be worth giving you sort of a history lesson, if you will, on some of the early gun building projects of my youth. You know, back when I was in high school and early college, when I had more time on my hands and less money, for a while I was on sort of a quest to build the best muzzle-loading black powder pistol that could possibly be built for under $20. Now, over the years, this quest resulted in the design and fabrication of about 4 prototypes. I don't have any of these prototypes in my possession anymore, but I do have original video footage of most of them. So I should be able to illustrate this history lesson as I'm narrating some of the features and stories behind these guns. Now, my first black powder pistol was eventually to earn the nickname the Rogue, and not for the reasons that you might expect for a homemade gun. Rather, it was so christened because it went rogue against the normal design process, in that it was never really designed. I just kind of built it. It started with a barrel that was made out of a piece of hexagonal drill steel that I bored out to approximately 36 caliber. Although, as I recall, my drill bit was not long enough to go through the entire barrel, and so I drilled in from one side, flipped the barrel around and drilled in from the other, and somewhere in the middle the 2 holes almost made it up perfectly. But there was a slight angle between them and certainly a noticeable transition point. Of course, at that time, I was simply drilling the barrel with an electric hand drill. That was all I had when I first got into building guns. So the barrel was definitely imperfect in its design and fabrication, but it was a big enough piece of drill steel that with a light charge of black powder and a 36 caliber round ball that doesn't weigh a whole lot, it was still fairly safe, despite the roughness of the bore and the imperfect union of the 2 holes. So, to this barrel, I then affixed a closure mechanism at the back that basically came down to welding the barrel shut on one end and then drilling a small flash hole over which I could then attach a primer by means of a plate that was simply screwed onto the back. So in order to re-prime this gun, you had to disassemble it by taking out some screws that would allow you to take the plate off and then put another primer in and replace the plate and screw it back in place. It was rather tedious to reload, but it worked. The hammer mechanism and trigger were relatively simple, except they had one interesting quirk. You know, the firing pin was integral with the hammer, and so when it fell, of course, it would hit the primer if there was a primer in the priming pocket or in the flash hole. If there was no primer in the flash hole, then the firing pin could go a little further forward. And the way that the hammer was designed, it was basically just a bar with an extension spring to pull it forward, and then another bar coming off forward that engaged with the trigger. And then when you pulled the trigger, that bar would slip off the trigger and the hammer could fall. Now, if the hammer fell and set off a primer, everything was fine. But if there was no primer in the flash hole, then the hammer could fall far enough that that bar on the hammer would impact the back of the trigger right about where your finger was. And so if you went to dry fire this thing with no primer in the flash hole, you would get a sudden impact to the back of the trigger, or transferred through the trigger to your finger. It actually felt a lot like an electrical shock, like touching an electric fence. And I remember my friends of the day deriving great amusement from trying to get each other to dry fire this so that they could experience the shocking sensation of dry firing this particular piece. Now, for as crude of a design as it was, the Rogue worked incredibly well. It was remarkably accurate. I remember on one occasion I took it up to my cousin's place, and my cousin Kyle and I were out shooting the thing from an offhand position at about 15 yards, and my cousin Kyle was consistently grouping shots in about a 4-inch circle. That's a pretty respectable shooting with any handgun offhand at 15 yards, let alone with a homemade black powder pistol that has a rough drilled barrel that isn't straight and doesn't have any sights. So, given all of its faults, the performance of the Rogue was pretty impressive. And perhaps that's at least partially what inspired me to continue with more sophisticated black powder pistol designs over the coming years. My second black powder pistol was called the Squire. I think the idea at the time was that it was sort of a companion firearm, a sidekick, or a squire, if you will. And it was a relatively compact firearm. The barrel was made out of the same heavy hexagonal drill steel as the barrel for the Rogue had been, but in this case I cut it much shorter so that I could get a drill bit all the way through it. By this time I had acquired a benchtop drill press, which made the drilling operation a little bit easier, a little bit more controlled, at least at first. After drilling an initial bore hole with a conventional drill bit, I decided to bore out the barrel to .45 caliber using a custom single flute reamer that I made by welding a piece of scrap tool steel to the side of a round shank. And so because the reamer was eccentric, the barrel had to oscillate back and forth as I was drilling the hole. And so I can remember this thing just rattling back and forth, or wobbling back and forth rapidly as I was drilling the bore out to .45 caliber. And yet, despite the wobble and the unusually crude reamer, the bore came out beautifully smooth. So it was a nice, smooth, straight bore, albeit in a somewhat shorter barrel. It was a larger caliber. I did draw up the design for the Squire ahead of time in a CAD program. Simple two-dimensional sketch, but at least I had a cross-section of how the gun was going to go together. So it was a much more sophisticated design. I designed it as a break action, so there was a plate welded across the back of the barrel with a pocket to hold a primer, and then the barrel would break open so you could access the priming pocket and prime the gun, and you'd close it up and finish loading it from the muzzle, of course. You'll load the powder and ball from the muzzle, preferably with spent primer in the flash hole, but and then reprime when you were ready to fire. So it was a much more sophisticated design, but it didn't really work all that well. It functioned, well. It functioned according to its design, but it just wasn't very accurate. And there were a number of contributing factors to that. For one thing, the trigger pull came out excruciatingly stiff. You'd go to pull the trigger and you start squeezing and you squeeze harder and harder, and about the time your hand started shaking violently from the exertion, the gun would finally go off. So that was certainly a contributing factor to the poor accuracy, plus the barrel being shorter might have been a contributing factor. And then the grip was at kind of an awkward angle in retrospect, certainly not the most ergonomic grip. And who knows if maybe there were other factors as well. But really, the Squire was the perfect antithesis of the Rogue. It succeeded in all the ways that the Rogue failed, or rather, I should say, it excelled in all the ways that the Rogue was deficient in terms of design and in terms of barrel straightness and so forth. But whereas the Rogue had been remarkably accurate, remarkably functional, the Squire, not so much. In fact, I don't know if I ever actually hit anything with the Squire. I remember one occasion where my friend Jim and I took the thing out shooting at a local range, and, well, range being just a place where people went out and shoot, and on this particular occasion we found somebody had dumped an old washing machine out there. So we were using this washing machine as a target and shooting from relatively close range, probably only 15 or 20 feet. We went through 40 or 50 rounds, and I think Jim hit the washing machine once, maybe twice. I don't think I hit it at all. So the Squire, despite being in some respects a relatively sophisticated design, didn't really work all that well as a functional firearm. And yet, I liked the basic concept of the Squire, the break-action black powder pistol design, well enough that I decided to give it a second chance. And so this resulted in the creation of my third black powder pistol, which we called the Knight. Next step up in rank from a Squire would be a Knight, so that was the basis for the name there. And really, that's all that it was. It was a refinement of the Squire design. I tweaked some dimensions, changed the angle of the grip, changed the dimensions of the hammer trigger interface to lighten up the trigger pull. I made the barrel a little bit longer. I added a front sight post. Other than that, it was pretty much the same basic gun. The difference is that where the Squire had a lot of shortcomings, the Knight really worked well. It was a very functional black powder firearm. I mean, the accuracy wasn't necessarily great compared to modern centerfire firearms, but for a smoothbore black powder pistol, it was certainly respectable. The recoil was substantial because I typically load it with about 60 grains of black powder behind a 45 caliber round ball. So it packed a fairly hefty punch, but the gun was heavy enough that the recoil was still manageable. So I don't know what more to say about the Knight. It didn't really generate any interesting stories due to failures or malfunctions. It just worked really well. Now, my fourth and final black powder pistol was called the Scout because it really was kind of an expedition into new territory in a variety of regards. For one thing, by this time I was in college. I had taken courses in structural mechanics, and I learned how to analyze stresses in cylindrical thick-walled pressure vessels, which is basically what a gun barrel is. And so I was able to do a lot more analysis on the design as I was designing it, and figure out, how thick the barrel needed to be, how big different components needed to be to bear the stresses that were impinged upon them, rather than just kind of erring on the side of conservatism with everything as I had in the past. So this led to a little lighter, a little bit more refined gun design. By this time, I'd also acquired a small benchtop metalworking lathe, and so I had the ability to machine components on a cylindrical coordinate system. And so I really kind of designed the gun around this capability and made everything as cylindrical as possible. Instead of having a pivoting hammer like I had in the previous designs, I had a linear hammer that slid inside of a cylindrical housing. The hammer itself was cylindrical with a lip that would catch on the sear mechanism. There was a slot in the side of the housing that permitted attachment of a cylindrical stud, which would then serve as the handle for cocking, and then there was also an angled slot to the side that you could lock it into to put it on basically half cock as a safety setting. With the lathe, I was also able to turn a rifling button, and so with the aid of a homemade hydraulic press, I was able to produce a 36 caliber button rifle barrel out of 3/4 inch 1018 round stock for use in the Scout. And so that lent itself to a substantial improvement in accuracy over previous designs. And really, overall, the Scout turned out really well. Even though I was doing a lot of things very differently, trying out a lot of new things, it really came out very well. Kind of my one regret with the Scout was that the welds that attached the barrel and the receiver to the frame turned out a little tacky. They were structurally sound, but they looked a little messy, and so they kind of messed up the aesthetics of the gun, made it look less refined than I thought the design really overall was. But appearances aside, it was still a great gun. Accuracy with that rifle barrel was really pretty comparable to any commercial centerfire handgun. The Scout didn't have any sights per se, but the barrel and the hammer housing were both 3/4 inch diameter coaxial round stock, and so you could pretty much line up the contours of the housing with the contours of the barrel and line it up on target and hit what you were aiming at within reason. So performance was really pretty good. I guess, the first time I took the Scout out and tested it, of course, because the barrel was a lot lighter than I had done on previous designs, I was concerned that I should probably not be holding it when I test fired it. And so I clamped it in a vise that was mounted on the tailgate of my truck, but I didn't want to mar the finish on the barrel by clamping it in the vise directly. So I took some driving gloves that I had in my truck and just wrapped a glove around the barrel and then clamped it in the vise. And I wasn't really noticing as I was cinching down the vise, but the thumb of the glove kind of came unwrapped and draped in front of the barrel. And so when I pulled the trigger with a string, the gun, of course, went off and it fired. It performed beautifully, but the muzzle blast completely shredded the thumb of the glove. And so in my next email home, when I was telling my folks about the testing of the Scout, I titled the email "Lost a Thumb," which created a bit of consternation until they realized it was only my glove that had been subject to the loss of a thumb. So the Scout really turned out very well, but then I graduated from college and got busy with other things and haven't done any real gun building since. Hopefully I'll be able to remedy that one of these days. I think it'd be a lot of fun to build another black powder pistol someday, and most likely if I do another one I will film the whole process. So if you're subscribed to my channel, you'll be notified about that when and if I get around to doing it. Until then, thanks for watching the Idahoan Show.